He invited his black ex-wife to his wedding to humiliate her. So her arrival shocked everyone. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, addressed in handwriting Camila would recognize anywhere. Inside, an elegant invitation on pearlescent paper announced the wedding of Richard Thompson and Madison Clark. At the bottom, a handwritten note made her blood run cold. I thought you might like to see how a real wedding is done. I hope you'll attend, it will be instructive. Camila Santos was 32 years old and never imagined that her ex-husband was capable of such calculated cruelty. After 6 years of marriage that ended when he realized he could no longer introduce her in his professional circles, Richard now wanted her to witness his new beginning with a blonde lawyer, the daughter of a federal judge. The separation had been devastating not only because of the end of the relationship, but because of the way Richard had systematically isolated her from mutual friends and made a point of spreading poisonous comments about irreconcilable differences in background. In other words, he had grown tired of explaining to colleagues at the law firm why he had chosen a black journalist from the suburbs when he could have had anyone. 3 years later, as she held that invitation in her hands, Camila smiled in a way that her few enemies knew well. Richard had no idea who she had become since he had left her life like a destructive hurricane. During the first few months after the divorce, she had put her professional life on autopilot, writing articles about local politics for a neighborhood newspaper, living in a tiny apartment, and avoiding any social events where she might run into him or people in his circle. But something had changed when she received an unexpected offer to investigate a scandal involving irregularities in municipal bids. The article she produced not only won national awards, but caught the attention of major media outlets. Within 2 years, Camila had become one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. What Richard definitely didn't know was that during these investigations, she had developed an impressive network of contacts in police stations, courts, and regulatory agencies. People who respected her for her serious work and who eventually began to share interesting information about certain lawyers who were courting public contracts through questionable methods. Camila folded the invitation carefully and placed it on the table. Then she opened her laptop and began typing an email to David Mendez, her editor-in-chief, with a subject line, "Special assignment, available for event on Saturday?" As she typed, her eyes sparkled with that dangerous intensity she always developed when she sensed a big story. Richard wanted her to go to his wedding to feel diminished, but what he didn't realize was that he was about to become the headline of an investigation she had been preparing for months. If this story of revenge and overcoming adversity is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened at that wedding was just the beginning of a twist that turned the planned humiliation into the greatest life lesson Richard would ever receive. During the last months of his marriage, Richard had become a master of calculated humiliation. At office parties, he would introduce Camila as my journalist wife in a tone that belittled her profession. When colleagues praised her work, he would quickly change the subject or make jokes about the tabloid press that only wants ratings. The last straw came at the Lawyers Association's end-of-year party, when Richard literally pretended not to see her standing alone at the bar while he talked to Madison Clark about women who really understand the business world. Camila heard every word of that conversation, including when he said that some people just aren't cut out for certain environments. 3 years later, as she reread the malicious invitation, Camila remembered the feeling of invisibility that Richard cultivated around her. He had perfected the art of making her feel inadequate without ever having to say directly that the problem was her color or social background. Now, looking at her desk piled high with files on irregularities in municipal tenders, she smiled at the thought of what Richard didn't know about her new life. Over the past 18 months, Camila had built a reputation that opened doors in places Richard could never enter. Police Chief Marcos Ferreira, for example, had become a valuable ally after she exposed a corruption scheme that nearly destroyed his career. Now, whenever she needed information about criminal cases or ongoing investigations, a simple phone call took care of everything. That was how she discovered that Richard Thompson was not just a successful lawyer with influential clients. He was the mastermind behind a sophisticated bid-rigging scheme involving at least 3 construction companies and 2 city councilmen. The most ironic part was that Richard believed he was being discreet. His meetings at expensive restaurants, the contracts signed at exclusive clubs, the bank transfers made through shell companies, all meticulously documented by investigators who didn't even know they were helping a former wife thirsty for justice. David Mendez had been hesitant when Camila first brought up the investigation into Richard. "Camila, I know you guys have history, but we need to make sure this isn't personal," he said during a meeting the previous month. "David," she replied, spreading photographs, bank statements, and audio recordings across the table. When someone steals public money for 3 years and uses those resources to fund a lavish lifestyle, it ceases to be personal and becomes a matter of public interest. The look on David's face changed completely when she played a recording of Richard explaining to a client how to get around transparency requirements in municipal contracts. My God, Camila. That's enough to bring down half the city council. But Richard had no idea that his life was being dissected by one of the most feared journalists in the state. In fact, he still thought Camila was that insecure woman who cried when he asked for a divorce. 2 days after receiving the invitation, Camila received a message on WhatsApp that confirmed her suspicions about her ex-husband's unchanging personality. Camila, I hope you understand that the invitation was a gesture of civility. Madison thought it would be elegant. I hope you don't show up dressed inappropriately. You know how that environment can be demanding. She screenshotted the message immediately. Not just because of the audacity, but because that condescending tone would be useful later, when she needed to demonstrate Richard's character to a larger audience. Camila's response was surgical. Thanks for your concern, Richard. Rest assured, I will be appropriately dressed for the occasion. What he didn't know was that appropriately dressed included a hidden digital recorder, a flash drive containing 2 years of research, and the company of someone who would remind the entire party exactly who Camila Santos had become. As she typed her reply, her eyes fell on a framed photo on her desk, she receiving the National Investigative Journalism Award from the Minister of Justice. Next to the photo was the business card of Alexander Costa, a federal prosecutor specializing in crimes against the public administration, who had become much more than a professional contact in recent months. Did Richard want a spectacle? She would give him a spectacle. But the protagonist would not be who he imagined. Every arrogant message he sent, every condescending comment about her suitability for his environment, only fueled a determination that grew like a controlled fire. Richard had spent years making her feel small in a world he considered his by right. Now, as she organized the final pieces of evidence that would destroy not only his reputation but his freedom, one thing was certain: the man who had tried to teach her about her place was about to discover that some places are earned, not inherited. Alexander Costa was not just another professional contact in Camila's address book. When they met during an investigation into money laundering in public works, the chemistry was immediate and impossible to ignore. He was the kind of man who commanded respect in any environment. Tall, confident posture, penetrating gaze that made witnesses confess crimes without realizing it. Camila, are you sure you want to dive into this investigation? Alexander asked during an intimate dinner 3 weeks before the wedding. They were reviewing the files scattered across the table in his apartment, between wine glasses and forgotten plates. Richard Thompson has powerful connections. If we mess up, he can destroy your career. She smiled in that way he knew so well, the smile of someone who knows exactly what she's doing. Alexander, my career has been attacked before, remember? And I survived. Now I have you by my side. The investigation into Richard had begun as a casual suspicion, but it had turned into a complex operation involving months of discreet work. Camila had discovered that he not only rigged bids, but also used shell companies to launder money from overpriced contracts. The pattern was always the same. Richard would recommend friendly companies for municipal contracts. Those companies would charge absurd prices, and a percentage would be returned to offshore accounts linked to him through an intricate network of legal partnerships. But uncovering the scheme was only half the job. Proving everything beyond a shadow of a doubt required evidence that could withstand the best team of lawyers Richard's money could buy. That's where Alexander became indispensable. As a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, he had taught Camila exactly what kind of evidence would be needed for a solid indictment. We need bank records, communications that demonstrate criminal intent, and at least 3 independent sources confirming the same pattern, he explained during one of their long nights working together. Meanwhile, Richard continued sending messages that only confirmed the kind of person he had become. The week before the wedding, he wrote, Camila, Madison suggested that you might prefer to sit at the back tables, near the service entrance. It would be more discreet, considering the circumstances. Camila screenshotted the message immediately and sent it to Alexander with a laughing emoji. His response was instant: this guy really has no idea what's coming. But Richard wasn't just being condescending, he was making mistakes. Every arrogant message, every comment about appropriateness and discretion revealed a man who believed he was completely safe. A man who had become careless because he thought he would never be confronted. The first major breakthrough in the investigation came through Paula Mendez, a secretary in the city's procurement department who had noticed irregularities in the processes where Richard worked. Paula was the cousin of David, Camila's editor-in-chief, and had initially sought help through that family connection. The companies that win bids when Dr. Thompson is involved always follow the same pattern, Paula explained during a discreet meeting at a cafe far from the city center. They appear out of nowhere, win million-dollar contracts, perform questionable services, and disappear. But the money always goes to the same places. Paula had access to documents revealing the entire schedule of payments, transfers, and contract changes. More importantly, she had printouts of WhatsApp conversations from the City Hall's internal group, where employees commented on the special protection certain companies received when Richard was involved. Dr. Thompson made it clear that some cases are sensitive and must be treated with absolute discretion, Paula showed in one of the recorded conversations. Anyone who asks unnecessary questions can look for another job. With this evidence in hand, Alexander obtained a court order to investigate the bank accounts of the companies involved. What they discovered was even more impressive than they had imagined. Richard had embezzled more than $2 million in public contracts over the past 3 years. But there was something else. During one of the bank analyses, Alexander discovered that Richard had used part of this money to finance his own wedding. The party, which would cost more than $100,000, was being paid for, literally, with money stolen from the public coffers. "Camila," Alexander said in a late-night phone call, his voice tense with contained excitement, "I just found out something that will make this wedding unforgettable. Richard isn't just celebrating with Madison, he's celebrating with money that should be funding schools and hospitals." At that moment, Camila realized that the plan needed to be adjusted. It was no longer enough to just show up at the wedding and impress the guests. She had the opportunity to turn Richard's celebration into the scene of his own destruction. While Richard continued to send messages about appropriateness and suggesting that she might be better off declining the invitation, Camila was coordinating the final details of an operation that would involve not only her and Alexander, but also a team of federal investigators, journalists from national outlets, and representatives from the Department of Justice. Richard Thompson's wedding would be remembered forever, but not for the reasons he imagined. The irony was delicious. The man who had spent years making her feel inadequate for certain environments was about to discover that some environments have rules that neither stolen money nor arrogance can break. For a moment, when Camila looked at the files organized on her desk, bank statements, audio recordings, printouts of conversations, court orders, she felt the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. But anyone who knows true justice knows that it requires courage precisely when silence would be easier. The black Rolls-Royce pulled up smoothly in front of the country club where Richard Thompson's wedding was taking place. When Alexander got out of the driver's side and walked around the vehicle to open Camila's door, all the guests smoking on the porch stopped talking. Camila emerged like a vision in gold, a couture gown that hugged every curve perfectly, jewelry that sparkled in the afternoon sun, hair in elegant waves that framed her radiant face. She didn't look like a rejected ex-wife. She looked like a queen returning to her kingdom. "My God, is that Camila?" whispered a guest on the balcony, loud enough to be heard. Alexander, impeccable in his Italian tuxedo, offered her his arm with a smile that made married women's hearts skip a beat. They walked through the entrance as if they owned the place, completely ignoring the stares and whispered conversations that spread like waves around them. Richard was greeting guests at the entrance to the main hall when he saw the commotion. He turned casually, expecting to see some local politician arriving late, and felt the blood drain from his veins. "It can't be," he murmured, his champagne glass trembling slightly in his hand. Madison, stunning in her $15,000 wedding dress, paid for, ironically, with money embezzled from the construction of a municipal daycare center, followed her husband's gaze and felt a knot in her stomach. "Richard, who's that woman?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Camila," he said, as if pronouncing the name was physical. "My ex-wife." Madison blinked several times, trying to process the information. The woman approaching them with the elegance of a runway model looked nothing like the inappropriate person Richard had described during their 2-year relationship. "Good afternoon, Richard," Camila said as she approached, her voice like honey poured over sharp blades. "Madison, you look absolutely stunning. Congratulations on your wedding." Alexander extended his hand politely. Alexander Costa, federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes. "It's a pleasure to meet you both." Richard choked on his champagne. "Federal prosecutor?" "Oh yes," Alexander replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Camila and I met during an investigation. She's one of the most respected journalists when it comes to exposing corruption in public contracts. Richard's face drained of color. His hands began to shake visibly as the dots connected in his mind like dominoes falling in sequence. Actually, Camila continued, removing an elegant envelope from her purse, I brought a very special wedding gift. I thought you might like to see it. Madison, still confused but sensing the growing tension, tried to maintain her social composure. How kind of you, Camila. You shouldn't have bothered. Oh, but I insisted, smiled Camila, opening the envelope and removing a series of photographs printed on high-quality photo paper. These are records of some of the most memorable moments of Richard's legal career. The first photo showed Richard entering a discreet restaurant with three men identified in the caption as CEOs of Millennium Construction, Solar Incorporados, and Primus Edificacos. The date was clearly visible, 2 days before the bid for the construction of the new municipal hospital. Richard tried to grab the photos, but Camila kept them out of his reach with a graceful movement. Let me show you the whole series first. The second photo showed Richard receiving an envelope from one of the businessmen in the parking lot of the same restaurant. The third captured the exact moment when he was counting the money inside his BMW. Camila, what are you doing? Richard whispered, his voice hoarse with panic. Sharing memories, she replied sweetly. After all, these photos document how you managed to pay for this wonderful party. Madison took one of the photos with trembling hands. Richard, what is she talking about? That's when Camila took out her smartphone and pressed play on an audio recording. Richard's voice echoed clearly and unmistakably. The important thing is that the right companies win the right contracts. If a few processes need to be adjusted to ensure that, well, that's just how business works in this town. The blood had completely drained from Richard's face. He looked around desperately, realizing that several nearby guests had stopped talking and were paying attention to the scene unfolding before them. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice now a desperate whisper. Paula Mendez, from the bidding department, is a very brave woman, Camila explained calmly. She meticulously documented your special instructions on which companies should receive preferential treatment. Alexander stepped forward, removing a leather folder from his jacket. Actually, Richard, I need to inform you that a federal investigation into municipal bidding fraud was officially opened this morning. Interestingly, your name appears on all of the questionable contracts from the last 3 years. Madison dropped the photos on the floor, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Richard, tell me this isn't true. Of course it's not true. Richard exploded, but his voice came out too high-pitched, too desperate. These photos could be fake, these recordings could be edited. Camila smiled and took a tablet out of her bag, where she opened a detailed spreadsheet. I'm glad you mentioned that. Because here we have the bank statements for the offshore accounts linked to your shell companies. $2,300,000 embezzled in 3 years. She turned the tablet toward Madison, who read the numbers with growing horror. Richard, that's more than you said you earned in a year. And here, Camila continued, sliding her finger across the screen, we have the specific payments for this party. The catering, the band, the venue, the flowers. All paid for with money that should have been used to build schools and renovate hospitals. Richard's world was collapsing live, in front of 150 guests that included some of the city's most influential lawyers, several politicians, and half a dozen journalists that Alexander had discreetly invited. Madison, Camila said gently, addressing the shocked bride, did you know that the dress you're wearing was bought with money intended for the construction of a daycare center in the suburbs? 23 children are without early childhood education because Richard needed to impress his wedding guests. Madison began to cry, not with marital joy, but with absolute horror. Richard, tell me this is a lie. Tell me now. Richard looked at his wife, at Camila, at Alexander, at the guests who now formed a circle around them. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. That's when the flashes started. The journalists present had recognized the magnitude of the story unfolding before them. The wedding of the year was turning into the most dramatic public display of corruption the city had ever seen. Please, Richard finally managed to whisper, don't do this here. Not today. Camila tilted her head with false compassion. Oh, Richard. Remember when you said I'd never learn how to behave in certain environments? Well, I just learned that some environments have rules about honesty that even stolen money can't break. Alexander closed the folder and returned it to his jacket's inside pocket. Richard Thompson, you have the right to remain silent, but I must inform you that a team of federal agents is on its way to execute search and seizure warrants at your home and office. The silence that fell over the group was broken only by the sound of Madison violently removing her wedding ring and throwing it on the marble floor, where it ricocheted with a metallic clink that echoed like a final sentence. As the guests began to murmur among themselves and the cameras continued to click, a single certainty took shape in the minds of everyone present. This wedding would be remembered forever, but not for the reasons anyone had planned. And in the center of all this carefully orchestrated devastation, Camila remained serene and elegant, like a queen who had just regained her kingdom, not through violence or cruelty, but through the most powerful weapon there is, the truth served at the perfect time and place. The flashes continued to click as Richard was escorted away by federal agents. His hands cuffed behind his back, his $3,000 suit rumpled, his face contorted with panic, the image that would grace every front page the next day. Madison had disappeared from the hall 20 minutes after the revelation, taking only her purse and leaving behind her wedding dress, bloodied from tearing off the jewelry Richard had bought with stolen money. Her parents, influential politicians who had paid for half the party, were seen leaving through the back door, completely avoiding the journalists. Camila Santos, from the National Investigative Journalism Network, announced a reporter to the cameras positioned at the club's entrance. The journalist who exposed one of the biggest municipal corruption schemes in recent years, at a time that couldn't have been better planned. 6 months later, Camila was sitting in the panoramic office of her new crisis communications consulting firm, located on the top floor of a skyscraper in the financial district. Through the window, she could see the building where Richard had worked before being sentenced to 8 years in prison and fined $5 million. The phone rang. "Camila, it's Alexander," said the familiar voice on the other end of the line. "The final verdict is in. Richard lost everything, his house, his cars, his bank accounts. Madison got the marriage annulled on grounds of fraud. And there's more, she's suing him for damages." Camila smiled as she signed a contract with an international television network interested in documenting her investigation. "Poetic justice," she murmured. Her company had become a national reference after Richard's story went viral. Executives from large corporations sought her out not only to investigate internal irregularities, but to learn how to build solid reputations based on real transparency. Paula Mendez, the courageous employee who provided the initial evidence, had been promoted to Ethics and Transparency Coordinator for the city. During the inauguration ceremony, she made a point of mentioning, "None of this would have been possible without a woman who proved that the truth, served at the right moment, is more powerful than any political connection." David, her former editor, now worked as director of journalism at her company. "Camila," he said during a weekly meeting, "remember when you arrived at the newspaper 3 years ago, devastated after your divorce? Look at you now, revolutionizing investigative journalism across the country." On the coffee table in his office, framed in gold, was the front page of the newspaper from the day after the wedding. "Bride exposes $1 million scheme during her own wedding ceremony." The photo showed Camila and Alexander leaving the club hand in hand, she radiant in gold, he elegant in his tuxedo, while in the background federal agents led Richard away in handcuffs. Richard, for his part, had lost not only his freedom and money, but something even more precious to someone with his ego, social relevance. Former office colleagues avoided mentioning his name. The club where he got married removed all photos of the event from its social media. Madison had moved to another state and changed her last name back to her maiden name. One Friday afternoon, while Camila was reviewing proposals for a series of documentaries on corruption, she received an unexpected call. "Camila? It's Richard." The voice on the other end sounded broken, aged. I know I have no right to call, but I need you to know that." "Richard," she interrupted calmly, "I hope you're using your time in prison to reflect on the lives you destroyed with your greed. I have nothing to discuss with you. Please, just listen to me for a minute. I know I deserved all of this, but I never imagined that you had become so successful." Camila finished. "It's funny how people who try to bring us down are shocked when they discover our true capabilities." She hung up the phone and went back to work. There was no anger in her voice, no cruel satisfaction. Just the serenity of someone who had turned a devastating betrayal into fuel for an extraordinary life. That night, while having dinner with Alexander at her favorite restaurant, the same one where they had planned their wedding, he raised his glass in a toast. To the woman who proved that the best revenge is not destroying those who hurt you, but building something so great that they become irrelevant. Camila smiled, touching her glass to his. To discovering that our true strength only appears when we stop trying to prove our worth to those who never saw it. 2 years after the wedding that shocked the country, Camila had become one of the most influential journalists in Latin America. Richard was still serving his sentence, working in the prison library for $2 an hour, an irony she found perfectly appropriate. The lesson she had learned and now shared in lectures around the world was simple but revolutionary. When someone tries to make us feel small, our response should not be to shrink or lash out. Our response should be to grow so big that they realize how small they always were. Richard had tried to humiliate her at a wedding, but ended up giving her the perfect stage to show the world who she really was. Sometimes our greatest enemies do us the favor of revealing our own greatness. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your limits, leave a comment about how you overcame that situation. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that the sweetest revenge is simply living too well for our oppressors to ignore.